April 8th, 1943. The sky over occupied France is a hell of metal and fire. At 27,000 feet, the B-17 bomber Liberty Bell shudders with every anti-aircraft explosion, the sound of bullets tearing through its fuselage like steel claws. After hours of terror, it returns to base in England, looking like Swiss cheese, riddled with holes in the wings, tail, and main body. To the Allied generals, the scene repeated with every plane that miraculously came back, the same areas always damaged. The conclusion seemed obvious and irrefutable. Reinforce those areas, they ordered. Armor plates were welded exactly where the holes were concentrated. However, something terrible and inexplicable happened. Even with the extra protection, the rate of downed planes did not decrease. Logic was failing, despair was growing, and no one, absolutely no one, understood why. In the chilly hangars of the Suffolk base, the scene was a mix of relief and mechanical morgue. Crippled planes, freshly arrived from hell, were lined up in a cemetery of living machines. The smell of fuel and twisted metal hung in the air. Mechanics with cans of red paint circled each bullet hole, turning the fuselages into maps of pain. The wings, tail, and central body of the plane became scarlet constellations, a visual testament to where the enemy concentrated their fire. Generals and engineers pored over these diagrams, brows furrowed in concentration. Military logic was straightforward, forged in the heat of battle. If an area is hit repeatedly, it is weak. The enemy aims there, so that's where the armor should go. The order echoed through the hangars with the force of dogma. Extra armor on the wings, reinforcement on the tail. No one dared question the obvious. After all, the evidence was there, marked in vivid red on the metallic bodies of the only ones that returned to tell the story. Each new steel plate added was a gesture of hope, a bet on what they could see and touch.
They didn't realize that by focusing so intensely on the survivors, they were being blinded by them. The fatal error was not in their calculations, but in their perspective. The answer to saving the planes that fell was not in the holes of those that returned, but in the eerie silence of the parts that always arrived intact. In a stuffy room in London, far from the sound of machine guns, the war was fought with maps and reports. High-ranking officers with tired faces and impeccable uniforms analyzed the bomber diagrams. The silhouettes of the B-17s were covered in red dots, concentrated on the wings and rear fuselage. A general, with the authority of one who accepts no doubts, pointed to the marked areas. "It's simple, gentlemen. The evidence is clear. Armor where there are more holes." The reasoning was so straightforward, so visually convincing, that it became a mantra. Anyone who suggested otherwise would be seen as a fool. Engineers received the orders and executed them with precision. More steel was welded, making the planes heavier, less agile, and consuming more fuel. The crews boarded, trusting that the new armor would protect them. But the next missions brought the same bitter truth. Bombers continued to disappear from radars, falling in flames over enemy territory. Frustration in the command corridors was palpable, a heavy silence that no one dared break with uncomfortable questions. The military hierarchy, built on orders and obedience, left no room for doubt. Questioning the strategy was like questioning the war itself. The error persisted, invisible and deadly, protected by pride and the urgency for quick answers. They were trapped in a cycle of reinforcing their own failures, staring so fixedly at the problem that they could no longer see the solution.
While the generals racked their brains in England, The solution was taking shape thousands of miles away, in a place where the sound of war was replaced by the clatter chalk on a blackboard. In New York, at Columbia University, an elite group of mathematicians and scientists, known as the Statistical Research Group, SRG, had been secretly recruited to solve the most complex problems of the war effort. And among these geniuses, one figure stood out for his silence and calm: Abraham Wald. Wald was not a military man. He was a refugee, a Hungarian Jewish mathematician who had narrowly escaped the Nazi persecution that decimated his family. He carried no weapons but a mind capable of seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. In his gaze, there was the gravity of one who had seen the worst of humanity and found refuge in the absolute clarity of logic. When the reports of damaged planes arrived on his desk, oil-stained sheets with the same red dot diagrams that baffled the generals, Wald did not focus on what was there. His gaze was drawn to what was missing. He noticed the visual silence of the engines, the cockpit, and certain parts of the tail. These were areas that, on the returning planes, were almost always intact. While the military world saw this as a sign of safety, Wald felt a chill. There, in that blank space, he began to see the ghosts of the planes that never returned. The Columbia University building transformed into a secret weapon, a powerhouse of thought where the war was fought with equations. In the SRG corridors, the air vibrated with the energy of brilliant minds racing against time. The walls were covered in formulas and graphs, an invisible intellectual battlefield to the outside world. Abraham Wald, with his glasses slipping down his nose, sat at his desk, indifferent to the organized chaos around him. He took the bomber diagrams and over them placed sheets of transparency. With a pencil, he began tracing not the holes, but the empty spaces. He was not interested in the wounds of the survivors. He was hunting the fatal blows that downed the others. His mind, trained to find order in noise, began to form a frighteningly clear picture. The other scientists discussed probabilities and standard deviations, but Wald saw something more fundamental. He realized that the data they received was a trap. The sample was irredeemably corrupted. The reports did not represent all the planes that went into battle, only the lucky subset that managed to return. Each plane that landed in England, riddled with bullets, was a letter sent from the front, written by a survivor. And the most important message was not in the written words, but in the blank spaces. The areas without holes, he realized, were not bulletproof. They were, in fact, the most vulnerable. They were intact on the returning planes because any plane hit there simply did not return.
In the silence of his office, Wald deepened his analysis. He positioned the diagrams side by side, creating a mosaic of battle scars. The dense red stains on the wings, central fuselage, and tail gunner were impressive. Anyone would conclude that these were the areas most in need of protection. But then he pointed to the cockpit, the engines, and the fuel tanks. On these maps, these areas were like deserts, almost without any markings. The cruel irony of the situation hit him full force. Everyone was applauding the resilience of these areas, when they should have been terrified by their silence. He scribbled a note in the margin of a sheet, a phrase that would change everything. These holes tell only half the story. An assistant, curious about Wald's intensity, approached and saw what he was doing. Wald explained with disarming simplicity. The data was lying. The returning planes were not a representative sample of the fleet. They were a sample of the survivors. This distortion, caused by the very process of survival, was the key. He took a red pencil and, in a gesture that defied all military logic, circled the clean areas of the plane. Reinforce here, He wrote next to the engines and cockpit. "This is where they are fatal." For the first time, someone understood that the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence.
The silence of the untouched parts screened the truth that the noise of the bullets had hidden. The next morning, Abraham Wald entered a meeting room to present his discovery to a group of scientists and military officers. The air was thick with skepticism. On the blackboard, he drew the silhouette of a B-17, marking the locations of the holes, just as the generals did. But then, he did the unthinkable. With the chalk, he shaded the areas everyone ignored: the engines, the cockpit, the fuel system. He turned to the audience and with his calm and undramatic voice uttered the phrase that would turn the war strategy upside down. "Gentlemen, these holes show where a plane can be hit and still return to base. The intact areas are the fatal points." A deep and uncomfortable silence filled the room. A major, brow furrowed in disbelief, interrupted. "Hold on. Are you saying we should add extra armor precisely where there is no damage at all?" Wald, without losing his composure, simply nodded. He explained that mathematically, the planes hit in the areas he marked never returned to be part of the sample. They were the missing data, the ghosts in the statistics. The reasoning was so simple, and at the same time so deeply subversive, that it destroyed, in an instant, the foundation of the entire armor strategy. Military logic, built on direct observation, was being challenged by the invisible logic of statistics. In that moment, the war paused, and reason, for a brief instant, triumphed over instinct.
Wald's discovery was so radical that days later he was summoned to a meeting with the high military command in Washington. The room was imposing, cold, adorned with flags and occupied by generals whose expressions ranged from skepticism to hostility. They watched the frail civilian in a suit and tie holding only a few scribbled sheets of paper. With the same calm he used with the scientists, Wald explained his concept again. He drew on the blackboard, showing how the visible evidence of the holes was actually hiding the truth. "Gentlemen," he said, "with the best intentions, you are reinforcing the planes that have already proven capable of withstanding those damages. The planes we lose, the pilots who don't return, are the ones hit precisely where we see no holes on those that land." The words hung in the air, sounding like technical heresy. An older colonel, visibly irritated by the civilians' audacity, stood up. "Are you telling us that months of analysis, the experience of our best engineers and pilots, that all of this is wrong?" Wald, without a hint of arrogance, replied with a slight smile. "Not wrong, Colonel, just looking at an incomplete picture." The simplicity and strength of his logic began to break through the barrier of authority. The discomfort in the room turned into thoughtful silence. Resistance still existed, but the seed of doubt had been planted. At the end of the meeting, a general, still hesitant, authorized a limited test. Reason had won, by a threat. The order came down from the high command and reached the hangars like an enigma. Mechanics who had spent months welding steel plates on the wings and fuselages of the B-17s now received instructions to do the opposite. Under the biting cold of the English winter, they began removing the armor from the bullet-riddled areas and reinstalling it around the engines, over the cockpit, and near the fuel tanks. The same areas that, by miracle, always seemed to escape unscathed. Skepticism was widespread. Reinforce where there are no holes? That's madness, the soldiers murmured to each other, hammering against the metal. To them, it was like putting a bandage where there was no wound. But the orders were clear, and for the first time, the apparent madness came accompanied by pages of mathematical calculations. From a distance, officers watched the process with arms crossed, doubt etched on their faces. Abraham Wald was just a name in a memo, an invisible civilian whose theory was about to be tested on a real scale, with human lives at stake. With every rivet fixed, the tension mounted. When the first squadron of bombers, modified according to Wald's logic, lined up on the runway, the air was heavy with expectation. As the engines roared and the aircraft took off toward the heart of Germany, a question hung over the base. What if the mathematician is wrong? Each mission became a deadly experiment, a trial by fire for reason against instinct.
The first weeks after the change were tense. In the command posts, radar operators tracked the light dots representing the squadrons, holding their breath at every moment. But slowly, a new pattern began to emerge. More dots were returning. Planes that would previously have been given up for lost managed to limp back to base, with smoking engines and damaged cockpits, but with their crews alive. Mission reports began to tell a new story. Pilots described how their planes withstood direct impacts in areas that would previously have been fatal. The return rate for bombing missions increased in a remarkable and undeniable way. In the hangars, the mechanics now looked at the new armor plates with newfound respect. The mathematician's madness was working. Abraham Wald's name appeared discreetly in internal reports, a footnote in a monumental chapter of aerial warfare. He received no decorations nor was celebrated in parades. His victory was silent, measured not in medals, but in numbers rising on survival charts. In the corridors of the Statistical Research Group, Wald analyzed the new data. The curves representing aircraft losses began to fall. He drew a final line in his notebook and closed it, allowing himself a rare moment of relief. There was no celebration, only the deep and silent satisfaction of knowing that logic had prevailed, and that because of it, fathers and sons would return home. The impact of Wald's discovery went far beyond saving planes. The concept, born on a dusty blackboard, quickly gained a name: survivorship bias. And this idea began to spread like a virus of lucidity through the corridors of military and academic power. Strategists and analysts realized they were facing a fundamental flaw in human thinking: the fatal tendency to draw conclusions looking only at success cases, completely ignoring failures because they are no longer visible. The war, with its brutality, had provided the clearest and most tragic example of this error. In secret military conferences, Wald's reasoning was dissected and turned into doctrine. Officers learned to ask not just what worked, but also who is no longer here to tell us what went wrong. Intellectual humility became a strategic tool. The absence of data began to be treated as data itself. Wald's legacy began to transcend the battlefields. Civil engineers started re-evaluating how they studied structural failures. Doctors began questioning how they analyzed treatment efficacy by looking only at patients who improved. And economists began seeing the stock market with new eyes, realizing they only studied the companies that survived. Abraham Wald, without ever firing a shot, had given the world a new way to see reality, teaching everyone that the most important truth often hides in what the eye ignores.
Far from the noise of war and the corridors of power, Abraham Wald lived a modest and quiet life in New York. He was an anonymous figure, walking the streets with short steps, always with a notebook in his pocket. His colleagues in the SRG described him as a gentleman, soft-spoken, but with an intellectual intensity that could be intimidating. His mind, a fortress of logic and reason, carried deep and invisible scars. Wald was one of the last of his family. His parents, siblings, and other relatives did not escape Europe and were murdered during the Holocaust. He carried that loss with silent dignity, rarely speaking of his past. For Wald, mathematics was not just a profession, it was a refuge. It was a way to impose order on a world that had revealed itself as chaotic and brutal. Every equation he solved, every problem he unraveled, was an act of resistance against the irrationality that had destroyed his family. His dedication to saving pilots' lives was not born of abstract patriotism, but of personal and profound pain. He knew firsthand the human cost of errors in judgment and flawed logic. His genius was not just in his ability to manipulate numbers, but in his hidden empathy, translated into the universal language of statistics. He fought his own war, not with weapons, but with chalk, turning his personal tragedy into a shield to protect others. When World War II finally ended in 1945, the world exploded in celebration. Streets were filled with parades, soldiers were welcomed as heroes, and generals had their names etched in history. Newspaper headlines exalted bravery, sacrifice, and the military victories that secured peace. Amid all this euphoria, Abraham Wald's name was not mentioned. His contribution, one of the most significant to the survival of air crews, remained buried in classified reports. A secret known to few. The Statistical Research Group, the supergroup of geniuses that helped win the war, was quietly disbanded. Its members, including Wald, dispersed, returning to their academic lives as if nothing had happened. Wald returned to teaching at Columbia University, lecturing on probability theory and statistical inference to classes of young students who had no idea that their quiet and methodical professor had been one of the war's intellectual heroes. He never sought recognition and seemed perfectly content with his anonymity. For him, the reward was not glory, but proof that logic worked, while society built monuments to the heroes they could see. The man who taught the world to see the invisible remained in the shadows, satisfied with the silence. He understood that true triumph is not in applause, but in preventing error.
In December 1950, Abraham Wald's life came to an abrupt and tragically ironic end. He was traveling to India at the government's invitation for a series of lectures on statistics. Aboard a small plane, accompanied by his wife, he was flying over the Nilgiri Mountains in the south of the country. The weather worsened suddenly, and the aircraft was engulfed by a violent storm and dense clouds. The plane disappeared from radars. Search teams took days to find the wreckage, scattered across a remote hillside. There were no survivors. The news of his death was a footnote in Western newspapers, a brief obituary in academic publications. Few, outside the circles of mathematics and statistics, grasped the magnitude of the loss or the poetic cruelty of his end. The man who deciphered the secret of why planes fell, who used logic to save thousands of airmen from the sky, died exactly in the way he had spent the war trying to prevent. His death was a somber reminder that, while logic may give us an edge, it can never completely eliminate chance. Wald's journey ended as it began, in silence, far from the spotlight. But in a way, his end was consistent with his philosophy of life. He always taught that the absence of data is powerful data. His own absence
sudden and tragic, left a legacy that spoke louder than any speech. Reason is our best weapon, but life remains ultimately an enigma. Decades have passed since Abraham Wald scribbled his theory on a blackboard, but his idea is more relevant today than ever. The concept of survivorship bias has become a fundamental tool in countless fields he could never have imagined. On Wall Street, financial analysts use it to avoid deluding themselves with the track records of surviving investment funds, ignoring the thousands that went bankrupt. In medicine, researchers apply it to avoid false conclusions about treatment efficacy. In the technology era, software engineers and data scientists developing artificial intelligence are constantly policing their algorithms against survivorship bias to ensure systems make fair and accurate decisions. Every time a business leader asks, "What failed companies can we learn from?" or an engineer examines a product that broke instead of one that worked, Wald's spirit is present. His name may not be widely known to the public, but in academies, armed forces, and R&D labs around the world, he is revered as a giant. Wald left us an immortal lesson. True power comes not from strength, but from clarity. Not from certainty, but from the ability to question what seems obvious. He proved that the most heroic act of all can simply be to stop, think, and ask, "What am I not seeing?" The story of Abraham Wald teaches us that the most important lessons are often hidden in what we do not see. If you like stories that challenge the obvious and reveal the hidden truths of our world, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next video that will change the way you see reality.